on the airwaves. I don't know if you saw the latest couple of episodes. If you missed it, I will give you the condensed thumbnail recap. So this week, Sunday night, the focus shifted to Dennis Rodman in the third episode, and the fourth episode was more about Phil Jackson. Now, each documentary, installment, if you will, made sure not to go too far away from Michael Jordan. You got to know who butters your bread. That would be Michael Jordan. So it really is the Jordan documentary, and then you've got these supporting actors that go into it. So let us discuss the question: what were your takeaways on this latest installment of the Chicago Bulls look back in the Wayback Machine to the glory days of the 1990s? Now, I've got the Mustang, tabloid fodder, and Sniff. Yeah, we'll get to that, and we will tie all these things together. Now, hey, Dennis Rodman. We got to start with Dennis Rodman, who is a gigantic cartoon character. And, yeah, it was nostalgia. It was pretty cool to watch all of it locked together in a nice, pretty package there for Dennis Rodman, who was the definition as a basketball player of a self-made man, a student of the game. And they did highlight that part in addition to his eccentric ways there, that when it came to rebounding, Dennis Rodman was an evil genius. And they had one portion of the documentary where Rodman explained his rebounding prowess and the techniques. And it was very impressive for Dennis Rodman, who is often not even talked about as a basketball player, but only as a sideshow because of all the stuff that he did back in the day. And he told the story, and you wonder how much of this is real and how much of this is BS, but he told the story about how his friends, and they would get basketballs and shoot balls, and Rodman would only worry about where to position to get the rebound, and that he was always obsessed with how to become a dominant rebounder and whatnot. And then you had a segment where they looked back at the rivalry between the Chicago Bulls and the Pistons of the late 80s and the early 90s, and Brendan Malone, who had been an assistant with the Pistons, I thought this was interesting. He mentioned that they had a conversation with Chuck Daly, the legendary coach of Detroit basketball in that era, about reining in Dennis Rodman. And Rodman, when he first came into the NBA, was this naive, kind of wet behind the ears young pup and all that, and then he had slowly, and it started with the Pistons, morphed. And it didn't really get going until he left the Pistons, but he had some antics in Detroit. And the quote, which I wrote down because it was a great quote from Chuck Daly when he responded to his assistant coach with the Pistons about Rodman. He says, "You don't put a saddle on a Mustang," is what he said. And that's a great line. 99.9% of Dennis Rodman's defensive repertoire would be called illegal in the modern NBA, right? I mean, and it's only 20 years. That's a long time, I know, but for some people, it's not that long a time. But the lunch bucket, if you will, skill set of Dennis Rodman, which is not generally welcomed. The closest thing we have in the NBA today to Dennis Rodman, the type of player Rodman was, is Patrick Beverley of the People's Team, of the Clippers. But Beverly's an overachiever, and he's seen as a guy that's an all-hustle player and all that, but he doesn't do nearly the things that Dennis Rodman did back in the day. Rodman, he only averaged more than 10 points a game once his entire career in the NBA. The guy's a Hall of Famer because of rebounding and defense, but his offensive game was not good. Not good at all. He didn't even try. Oh, no. He spent more time kicking camera guys in the nuts than he did working on how to make baskets. Now, part B of this, part of this is like basketball porn because we have no basketball, but I covered the NBA when Rodman was doing his thing back in the 90s there, and Rodman was a social media star before social media, right? The Bulls of the 90s didn't have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. There was none of that stuff. But Rodman was a social media star without social media. What do I mean by that? Before social media, people turned to the gossip pages, and Rodman was grade A tabloid fodder. Whatever Rodman was doing, whatever starlet Rodman was with, whatever bar fight he was getting into back in the day, it was amusing that Dennis Rodman, they also showed some highlights of him when he was in college. I'd never seen those photos before, the video of Rodman at southeastern Oklahoma, I think it was. Maybe it was southwestern. I don't know. One of the Oklahoma directional schools, and they were called the Savages. They were called the Savages, and then they highlighted some of the other extracurricular activity that Dennis Rodman loved so much, including a 48-hour vacation during the season. And he was really the forefather in many ways, Dennis Rodman, to the load management of today, because we saw LeBron James in Miami and in Cleveland and other places he's bounced around the NBA here attempt in-season vacations, right? He did that in Cleveland famously, where he took a break and they came up with some fugazi injury, and then he ended up going down to Miami and all that. But Rodman, since this was all about Rodman, he had a thing where Craig Sager, the late great sideline reporter, joking around, goofing around with Rodman, handed him a $20 bill to pay for a fine, that kind of stuff. But Rodman was really so polarizing that he was the straw that stirred the drink in many ways for drama. I'm not saying he was the most important person on the Chicago Bulls, because obviously he was not. But in terms of drama-rama, Dennis Rodman was number one. If you liked him, you celebrated his bohemian tendencies. And he definitely had the bohemian tendencies. If you hated him, you goofed on him for his unorthodox shenanigans. I was always a Rodman guy. I always got a kick out of Rodman back in the day. But Rodman spent a cup of coffee with the Lakers after he left the Bulls in 1998, when they broke the Bulls up. He was actually out of the NBA for a while, and the Lakers signed him. He played a grand total of 23 games in Los Angeles. And at that time, way back in the hot tub time machine, yours truly, was covering the Lakers there and moonlighting, getting some audio, making a little money on the side to what I had going on. And my bosses always wanted Rodman sound, which became problematic because Rodman, even though he was only with the Lakers for a few months and didn't play all that much, despite his eccentric mannerisms on the court, he was very difficult to get a hold of when he was playing for the Lakers and all those other teams as well. But he did not like chatting with the media, especially after games. And so it became this odd cat and mouse game. And it was really a war of attrition. All right. And this is what I remember. The memory is a version of what really happened. You remember certain parts of it, but you don't remember everything. But as I remember Rodman, after he left the Bulls and went to the Lakers, there's this cat and mouse game, as I said there, and you had to wait him out because Rodman would – this is back when the Lakers played at the Forum in the hood in Inglewood, and Rodman would hide out in the showers in the back area there and wait for the media to leave. And Rodman, very savvy, realized in those days before – social media became the thing, the beat writers were on deadline. The beat writers were on a tight deadline because they had to get the story done to get into the newspaper. And, the internet was in the early stages. We were back in the AOL, Netscape, Navigator days of the internet, so they didn't really care. Media companies didn't care about the internet all that much. So the writers would run out, and then the TV guys had to make the 11 o'clock news, so they had to edit it, so the TV guys would be out of there. So it was just us radio schmucks that were waiting around for Rodman, and it was ridiculous how long that would last. And poor Carmen Electra, who was dating Rodman at that particular time, she was waiting in the tunnel, and he made her wait also. It wasn't just my fat ass that had to wait. Carmen Electra had to wait also in the tunnels and the bowels of the Great Western Forum back in the day. And then Rodman I love the fact most of the time, as I recall, Rodman would come out and talk to us, and he would it was like Shaq. Shaq's famous when he was playing for the Lakers. He would whisper. Well, he'd talk really, I guess, big giant person talking really low. And Rodman, he'd always have a hat and glasses on, and he never would look you in the eye. And I mean, I guess he technically could have looked you in the eye, but you wouldn't know because he had sunglasses on at night. At like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, he would be wearing the sunglasses and all that. Obviously not a fan of outsiders, but I found Rodman, I don't know if it's charming. Maybe it's charming in retrospect. I don't know that I found him charming at the time he was doing that, but he was not as condescending a schmuck as like Barry Bonds was in his heyday, which was around that same period of time. And all the features in the documentary. Some of the things I mentioned, the mid-season vacation there, the 48-hour bender with Carmen Electra in Vegas, and just the whole thing here. Now, last point. All right, last thing. So Michael Jordan, who growled and groaned when thinking about the bad boy Pistons, the nemesis of those Chicago Bulls teams in the early days of his run in the Windy City, and the roadblock in the journey to a dynasty. And it was pretty cool. I've read about this online, but to hear the people involved talk about it, the famous Jordan rules that the Pistons had under Chuck Daly on how to stop Michael Jordan, and they were explained in this documentary in great detail by John Spider Sally and Brendan Malone, who essentially, I jotted down a couple of notes here because I thought it was pretty good. I think it was A, you have to stop Jordan before he takes flight, because once he gets in the air, he's going to score. You had to push him to the elbow. Do not allow him to drive, which is obvious. You don't want the great players to drive past you, so you've got to push him to the elbow. Make him go left. He doesn't go well to the left, the Pistons thought in the Jordan rules back in the day, and trap him from the top. And if Jordan goes to the baseline, then you just have Bill Laimbeer and Rick Mahorn who would just hammer him. Right? The hammer of God. And the synopsis was hit Jordan every time he takes a shot. Let him shoot, but every time he takes a shot, just whack him, right, with Thor's hammer. And that's exactly what happened. It was a throwback. It was a throwback to the physicality it was allowed in the early 80s and 90s. And they did highlight the fact that people did not like this. This style of play was not aesthetically pleasing watching basketball. And it was not. And it got even worse after the Bulls. I remember when Fratello was coaching the Cavaliers around that period of time. It was just painful. Pat Riley's Knicks, slow it down. Terrible. Just not entertaining to watch at all. But that was an era where you celebrated machismo and having brass balls. And today, under the rules of society as we know them today, that would be high crimes and misdemeanors. And then you have the Sniff Brothers. This was hilarious. I had not heard anything about this. Michael Jordan's security team, which looked to be about 5 or 6 middle-aged, mostly African-American men who were called the Sniff Brothers, and they were all standing around chatting with Jordan before a game. Now, why were they called the Sniff Brothers? Because everyone was trying to sniff Michael Jordan's jock. And so I thought that was pretty good. Some other random musings, things that stood out. B.J. Armstrong, I tweeted out a photo of this, a screenshot. B.J. Armstrong is 52 years old. He was a guard for the Chicago Bulls back in those days. He still looks like he's about 10 years old. And I'm convinced he gets carded when he goes out to buy alcohol and booze and all that stuff. You had the story about Phil Jackson, which was interesting. I liked it, the fact they highlighted his college days at North Dakota. He was standing alongside in one of the photos they showed there, Bill Fitch, who I knew when he was coaching the Clippers at the end of his NBA coaching career, and Jimmy Rogers. Jimmy Rogers there, who had coached the Celtics also. How about that? North Dakota had 2 future NBA coaches on their staff and a future Hall of Fame greatest coach of all time, Phil Jackson, as a player. How about that one? My man Jerry Callahan pointed out, I didn't recognize Jimmy Rogers. I recognized Bill Fitch, but Callahan pointed out that Rogers was actually in the other side of the photo. And you had Phil Jackson. The other stuff that was cool, Phil Jackson, they highlighted the fact that he dropped acid back in the day. I think everyone back in those days dropped acid, though. And then they highlighted the fact that Phil Jackson, this was great, failed his first Chicago Bulls interview because he dressed like a hippie. And the Bulls head coach at the time, who was looking for an assistant, didn't like that particular look and thought this disheveled guy's not going to be a coach. And so Jerry Krause, who was just destroyed in the first couple of episodes, Jerry Krause had to tell Phil Jackson what to wear and had to coach him through the job hiring process to become an assistant coach with the Bulls. And so in many ways, Phil Jackson was a creation of Jerry Krause. And they went into all the other stuff about Phil Jackson, his love for Native American culture as a kid hanging out with Native American children in Montana and all that. It was interesting. It was a good watch.